Welcome to Inside Criminology. I'm your host, and in this deep dive, we explore Chapter 5 of Larry J. Siegel's Criminology, diving into the science of crime. Are criminals born or made?
It's the age-old question, really.
Exactly. From genes and brain function to childhood trauma and learned behavior, we examine the biological and psychological traits that may underlie criminal actions.
I don't think
Let's uncover what the research says and what it means for the justice system.
Yeah, it's arguably one of the most persistent questions in criminology.
Yeah.
Is there something inherent about certain individuals that makes them more prone to crime, or is it entirely shaped by their environment?
Right, and for a long time, criminology was kind of split. You had theories focused on choice, like the classical school, or, societal structures like Marxist theory.
Mm.
But then came a movement trying to apply science to human behavior, positivism.
Exactly. Positivism, which really got going in the 19th century, aimed for, well, empirical analysis, measurement, observation, applying the scientific method.
And that's where we get figures like Cesar Lombroso, often called the father of modern criminology, right? Even if his specific ideas seem pretty dated now.
Very dated. But yes, that's Lombroso, the one who looked for physical characteristics, the whole born criminal idea.
Ah, yes, that idea.
Precisely. Lombroso and his contemporaries, people like Garofalo and Ferri, they proposed that criminals were sort of evolutionary throwbacks. You could identify them, they thought, by physical stigmata.
Like asymmetrical faces, weird skull shapes, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And Garofalo even suggested they had a lower sensitivity to pain, which just seems...
Yeah, looking back, it feels highly problematic and, frankly, unscientific.
Oh, it is. His work now, it's mostly seen as a historical curiosity. The methodology was just fundamentally flawed. No control groups.
Right.
Ignoring crucial environmental factors like poverty, poor health, things that could actually cause some of those physical traits he was looking at.
And didn't he even admit later that it wasn't so simple?
He did. Even Lombroso himself later admitted that born criminals were just one, probably small, category among many types of offenders.
So that kind of rigid biological determinism, it fell out of favor for quite a while.
It really did. For a lot of the 20th century, the pendulum swung hard the other way towards sociological explanations. Focus on the social environment, poverty, peer groups, that sort of thing.
But the biological ideas, they didn't just vanish forever, did they? They kind of made a comeback.
They certainly did. They started picking up steam again, maybe most notably in the 1970s with the rise of sociobiology. People like E.O. Wilson were influential there.
Okay, sociobiology. What was the key insight they brought back into the discussion?
Well, the core idea is that biological and genetic factors influence our capacity to learn and perceive social behaviors. And importantly, these factors aren't isolated from the environment.
So they're fundamentally linked.
Exactly. It sees the gene as a key unit, driving survival, maybe even influence. It even tried to frame things like altruism in biological terms, like reciprocal altruism. Helping others might evolve if it ups the chance you get help back later.
Okay, so it's not just pure biology determining everything. It's an interaction. And this sort of paves the way for modern trait theory.
Yes, exactly. Modern trait theory really rejects that idea of a single gene or, a single psychological flaw causing crime. It's much more nuanced.
How so?
It sees criminal behavior as this complex outcome, an interaction between a person's unique mix of personal traits, biological and psychological, and the environmental factors they run into. Family, school, neighborhood, economics, all that stuff.
So the traits are more like predispositions, vulnerabilities, and the environment can either set them off or maybe even keep them in check.
That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah.
Someone might have, say, a predisposition for impulsivity. But whether that actually leads to criminal behavior, that depends heavily on their upbringing, their opportunities, their friends. Trait theorists aren't usually trying to explain, the specifics of why someone steals a car versus commits burglary. They're looking deeper at the underlying behaviors, aggression, violence, low impulse control that link up with these antisocial patterns.
And then it helps explain something that purely social theories sometimes have trouble with, which is why in the same really tough environment, some people become chronic offenders and others, well, they don't.
Precisely. Environment is crucial, no doubt. But trait theorists suggest that maybe those who become persistent criminals have some biological or psychological difference, something that makes them less resilient to those negative pressures, or maybe less able to control certain urges.
So it's not saying choice is out the window.
No, not at all. But it does challenge the idea that everyone starts with equal potential, what they call equipotentiality. It suggests our inherent makeup influences how we react to and interact with our environment.
Fascinating stuff. And modern trait theories, they generally fall into two big buckets, right? Biosocial and psychological.
That's the usual way to divide them up, yeah. Biosocial looks at the biological and genetic side, and psychological digs into mental processes, personality, learning, though honestly, they often overlap quite a bit, as we'll see.
Okay, let's dive into the biosocial side first then. What's the core idea there?
The core premise is basically that our genetic makeup contributes to our behavior, and that we aren't all born identical in our potential. So behavior comes from this dynamic interplay between inherited characteristics and the environment.
It's a direct contrast to any view that assumes we all start as a blank slate.
Exactly. Or with perfectly equal potential.
And does this include things like how well we learn?
Yes, definitely. Our capacity for learning, whether it's learning social norms or learning antisocial behavior, is influenced by our brain function, our biological processes. Learning isn't just something external happening to us. It involves real physical and chemical changes in the brain and nervous system.
And the environment can shape that capacity?
Hugely. It can support or hinder brain development and learning potential.
What about more basic drives, instincts?
Some biosocial theories do consider instinctual drives too, things that are maybe inherited, unlearned. You sometimes see mention of a drive to possess and control, which could potentially be linked to certain types of property or even sex crimes.
Okay, let's get into some specific examples of these biosocial links. We hear a lot, sometimes controversially, about things like diet affecting behavior.
Right, that's an area with some interesting research, though it's definitely debated. There have been studies linking diets high in sugar and carbs to aggression and violence. Some early work by Stephen Schoenthaler, for instance, suggested changing diets could reduce aggression.
But is the evidence really solid on that?
It's mixed, to be honest, especially for simple sugar intake. Some studies haven't found a strong link. However, the connection between low blood sugar hypoglycemia and antisocial behavior, violence, even brain dysfunction, that seems a bit more consistent in the research. You see higher rates reported in studies of inmates, for example.
So maybe the instability of blood sugar is more key than just eating candy bars.
That seems to be where the stronger signal might be, yeah. Another really big area is hormonal influences.
Testosterone comes to mind immediately.
For sure. James Q. Wilson, among others, talked about how hormones like testosterone, but also enzymes, neurotransmitters, they're all key chemical messengers influencing behavior.
And testosterone is often linked pretty directly to aggression, especially in males.
Yeah, the research does suggest that. Higher levels of male sex hormones, androgens, are associated with things like aggressive behavior, sensation-seeking, impulsivity, maybe even lower verbal skills traits that can be relevant to antisocial patterns.
And they find higher levels in some inmate populations.
Studies have shown that, yeah. Violent male inmates often have higher testosterone levels, and the fact that testosterone levels tend to decline as men age. That's even been proposed as one factor in why male crime rates drop off the aging out phenomenon.
How does that work, biologically speaking? What do the hormones do?
Well, they can influence how sensitive parts of the brain are to stimuli, maybe leading some people to seek out more intense stimulation or have a higher tolerance for pain or punishment. They can impact brain regions involved in emotional regulation and decision-making, too.
Making some folks more impulsive or emotionally volatile.
Potentially, yes. Less reason, more reaction, perhaps. It could promote stimulation-seeking impulsivity. Makes sense why it could link to thrill-seeking or impulsive acts.
And that's why you hear about things like anti-androgen drugs being explored for sex offenders.
Exactly. Though it's highly controversial, ethically complex, and the long-term effects aren't fully understood.
What about on the female side? The link to PMS sometimes comes up.
It does. It's been looked at, this idea that hormonal shifts during the menstrual cycle might link to aggressive behavior. Katharina Dalton's early work is often cited.
But I gather there are questions about that research.
Oh, definitely. Significant methodological issues in those early studies. The link is still really debated. Some argue the association, if it even exists for most women, is pretty weak. It could even be spurious, you know? Maybe stress triggers hormonal changes, not the other way around.
So unlikely to be a major driver of crime for most women.
Seems that way. While a very small percentage of women might experience significant anxiety or hostility linked to their cycle, the vast majority obviously don't engage in violent crime because of it.
Okay, shifting from internal chemistry.
Yeah.
What about environmental contaminants, things we absorb from the outside?
Lead exposure is a huge one here. The evidence is pretty strong linking lead poisoning,
Uh-huh.
especially in childhood, to later aggression, emotional problems, behavior disorders, even increased risk for things like schizophrenia.
Wow. So that's a clear environmental factor causing physical brain changes that affect behavior.
Exactly, a very direct link.
Are there other key biochemical factors Siegel mentions?
Yeah, low levels of an enzyme called MAO monoamine oxidase. That's been associated with increased risk for impulsivity, defiance, sensation seeking, traits linked to violence and property crime.
Interesting.
And there's an interesting gender point. Females tend to have higher MAO levels than males, which might be another piece of the puzzle regarding gender differences in crime rates.
And what about the idea that crime itself can be, well, biochemically rewarding?
Right, that connects to the brain's natural reward system,
Yep.
endorphins, natural opiates. The idea is that the risk, the novelty, maybe the sheer thrill of criminal activity, can trigger the release of these feel-good chemicals. Creates a kind of internal reinforcement for doing risky stuff. Jack Katz called it the pursuit of sneaky thrills.
Okay, so that covers a lot on the chemical side. Let's move to the physical structure and function of the brain itself, neurophysiological conditions.
Right, so here the research looks at links between brain dysfunction or actual physical damage and crime. Studies using psych tests, brainwave data like EEGs, or brain scans like PET scans. They've often found higher rates of brain abnormality or dysfunction in criminal populations, particularly linked to violent crime.
And ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, that falls under this umbrella.
It does. ADHD involves that persistent pattern of inattention, impulsivity, hyperactivity, usually starting in childhood. It's often linked to trouble in school, poor social skills, behavioral issues.
And the causes are debated.
Yeah, suspected causes range from neurological issues, prenatal stress, genetics, even family turmoil. But whatever the cause, research pretty consistently shows an association between ADHD and a higher risk for delinquency, substance abuse, and antisocial behavior that can persist into adulthood, especially if it occurs alongside something like conduct disorder.
So ADHD itself isn't necessarily a direct cause, but maybe a significant risk factor, a vulnerability.
Exactly. That's the idea. It can make school harder, which is itself a risk factor for delinquency. Early intervention, focusing on managing symptoms and supporting learning, can really help.
What about actual physical damage to the brain, like tumors or injuries?
Yeah, that's another area. Brain tumors, lesions, serious head injuries, especially if they affect the frontal or temporal lobes, which are critical for regulating behavior, planning, judgment, they have been linked to pretty significant personality changes. And sometimes, yes, psychological problems, including violent behavior.
The Charles Whitman case, the Texas tower sniper, often comes up here, right? He had a tumor.
He did. It's often cited, though the direct causal link is complex and debated in his specific case. But generally, damage in those brain regions can lead to antisocial behavior.
Yeah.
And in some cases, removing a tumor has actually resulted in behavior returning to normal.
Wow, that really highlights how much our physical brain dictates our behavior.
Absolutely. It's all intricately linked.
Okay, the last one under neurophysiology is arousal theory. What's that about?
This theory basically says that people differ in how their brains respond to stimuli. We all seek an optimal level of arousal, a sort of comfort zone. But some individuals, often called sensation seekers, seem to need much higher levels of stimulation to feel alert or comfortable.
So they get bored easily.
You could say that. And this intense need for input, for excitement, might lead them to engage in risky, aggressive, or even violent behavior, partly just to achieve that desired higher state of arousal.
And that might link to things like heart rate.
That's one idea that's been explored. Some studies find lower resting heart rates correlate with sensation seeking and aggression. The thinking is maybe these individuals need more external stimulation just to get their physiological arousal up to what feels normal for others. Brain chemistry, like serotonin levels, might also play a role.
Okay, so we've covered body chemistry, brain function now for the really big, often controversial one. Genetics and crime. The idea that criminal tendencies might be inherited.
Right. And this is where things can get really heated. The old simplistic idea, that you inherit criminality directly, that's pretty much dismissed by serious researchers now.
So what is the modern focus?
The focus now is on whether genetic factors might predispose individuals to certain traits that we know are linked to crime. Things like impulsivity, aggression, certain aspects of psychopathy. Not inheriting crime itself, but inheriting predispositions.
I remember the XYY chromosome thing back in the day, linked to the Richard Speck case. That seemed like early genetic excitement.
It did. That theory suggested men with an extra Y chromosome were somehow inherently more violent.
Hmm.
But it was pretty quickly debunked that chromosome structure just wasn't found disproportionately in violent offenders. But it did kind of spark more serious scientific interest in looking for genetic links, even if that specific theory was wrong.
So how do researchers actually try to study this link today? It seems tricky to isolate genetics.
It's very tricky. They use several main methods. One is looking at parental deviance. Studies pretty consistently show that children of criminal parents are more likely to break the law themselves. The Cambridge study in delinquent development is a classic here, found a much higher rate of offending among boys whose fathers were convicted criminals.
But wait, that could easily be environment, couldn't it? Learning, parenting styles, stigma.
Absolutely. That's the huge challenge with those studies. Disentangling nature and nurture is really hard. Shared environment, maybe antisocial parents pairing up, the family stigma, all plausible explanations besides just genetics.
So they also look at siblings.
Yes. The thinking is, if genetics play a role, siblings should show similar behavior patterns, and research often finds they do, especially same-sex siblings. But again, you have the shared environment problem. Plus, maybe deviant siblings influence each other directly, or share the same deviant friends. Peer influence is critical.
Okay, so that leads to twin studies and adoption studies. These seem designed specifically to try and pull apart genetics and environment.
Exactly. They're the cornerstone methods for this kind of research. Twin studies compare identical twins MZ, who are genetically identical, with fraternal twins DZ, who share about half their genes like regular siblings.
And the logic is,
If identical twins show significantly higher similarity or concordance for criminal behavior than fraternal twins, it suggests a genetic influence, because the main difference between them is the degree of genetic similarity. Studies like Christensen's in Denmark did find higher concordance for criminality in MZ twins compared to DZ twins.
okay, and adoption studies, how do they work?
They compare the behavior of children adopted shortly after birth to both their biological parents, who provide the genes, and their adoptive parents, who provide the environment. If the adoptee's criminal behavior tracks more closely with their biological parents, even if they never met them, that points towards a genetic link.
Are there key studies there?
The Hutchinson-Mendick study in Denmark is a really important one. They found a significant relationship between a biological father's criminality and the adopted son's likelihood of being arrested. The risk went up even more if both the biological and adoptive fathers were criminal.
So what's the sort of overall picture from these genetic studies? Is it saying crime is inherited?
The picture that emerges, especially from the adoption studies, isn't really about inheriting a crime gene. It's much more subtle. A big Swedish adoptee study, for instance, found genetic factors were significant for predisposition, but that a positive adoptive environment could strongly inhibit that genetic predisposition.
Ah, so it's that interaction again. Genetics might load the gun, but environment pulls the trigger.
That analogy captures the modern view reasonably well, yeah.
Yeah.
Genetics might create a vulnerability or a potential, but whether it manifests depends heavily on environmental triggers or protections. But it's still a very active area of research and debate. Critics raise valid points about methodology and the difficulty of truly controlling for all environmental factors.
Okay, one last area in the biosocial realm, evolutionary theory.
Right, this takes a much longer view. It suggests that certain human behavioral tendencies, maybe including things like aggression or risk-taking, could have evolved over millennia because they provided some kind of survival or reproductive advantage in ancestral environments.
Like traits that helped our ancestors compete for food or mates.
Precisely. The idea is that individuals with traits that help them acquire resources or find partners were more likely to survive and pass those traits down. So maybe male impulsivity and risk-taking are echoes of ancestral strategies for resource competition or attracting multiple mates. If these patterns are inherited, they could persist.
Siegel also mentions RK selection theory here. What's that?
That's one specific and quite controversial way some have tried to apply evolutionary ideas. It's a biological concept about reproductive strategies. Our selected species reproduce rapidly, little investment per offspring. K-selected reproduce slowly, high investment.
Okay, how does that apply to crime?
Some theorists have tried to map this onto human behavior, suggesting maybe males lean more towards R strategies, more partners, less investment, and females K strategies, fewer offspring, more care. And then linking these different strategies to different behavioral patterns, some of which might manifest as cunning, deception, or other antisocial traits, it's pretty speculative and controversial territory.
Definitely sounds like it. Okay, we've covered a huge amount on the biosocial side. What are the main criticisms these theories tend to face?
Well, a major concern is the potential for misuse. Critics worry about potentially racist or classist implications if these theories are twisted to explain crime statistics that show poor or minority groups are disproportionately involved, suggesting biological inferiority instead of focusing on systemic social problems like poverty or discrimination.
That's a serious concern.
Absolutely. Another criticism is that these theories often struggle to fully explain the big variations we see in crime rates across different places, different social groups, or even different historical periods. If it's primarily biological, why isn't crime more consistent?
And how do biosocial theorists typically respond to that?
They strongly push back against the idea that they're reviving Lombroso's deterministic biology. They emphasize, like we've discussed, that it's about potential or vulnerability interacting with the environment. They argue their approach can help explain patterns because it looks at how these predispositions interact with environmental opportunities or stressors, which do vary across place and time.
So they see it as adding a layer, not replacing social explanations.
Exactly. Behavior is seen as this complex product of biological factors interacting with environmental events. An impairment or trait might create an at-risk factor, but it often needs social or environmental problems, like family dysfunction, to actually trigger criminal behavior.
It really keeps coming back to that dynamic interplay, doesn't it?
It really does. Siegel mentions the Caspi study on early maturing girls. Their hormonal changes linked to early puberty were associated with delinquency, but only when combined with environmental factors like hanging out with older, crime-prone boys. It wasn't just the biology, and it wasn't just the environment. It was the interaction.
Right. That makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears now to the other major branch, psychological trait theories. This moves us from the body and brain more into the mind, thinking, learning, personality.
Exactly. Psychologists have obviously been involved in criminology for a long time, trying to understand how mental processes, personality, and individual psychology contribute to criminal behavior. You had early figures like Gabriel Tard talking about learning through imitation.
And the main perspectives Siegel covers are psychodynamic, behavioral, and cognitive.
That's right. Psychodynamic focuses on early experiences, the unconscious. Behavioral looks at learned actions, and cognitive examines how we think, perceive, and solve problems.
Let's start with psychodynamic theory, often associated with Sigmund Freud, right?
Yes, Freud is the key figure, although contemporary psychodynamic theory is broader. It really emphasizes the lasting impact of early childhood experiences, especially emotional attachments, on personality development and later relationships and behavior. The focus is often on unconscious drives, developmental processes, and how they shape who we are.
And the famous id, ego, and superego structure.
Exactly. That's Freud's model of the personality. The id is the primal pleasure-seeking part operating on impulse. The ego is the reality principle, trying to mediate between the id and the external world. And the superego is our conscience, our internalized sense of morality and ideals.
So how does this relate to crime?
Psychodynamic theory suggests that problems in developing a strong, healthy ego or superego, maybe due to childhood trauma, neglect, or unresolved conflicts, can lead to personality disturbances. This might mean an inability to control the id's impulses, or a lack of guilt or empathy, potentially resulting in criminal behavior.
So a weak ego might make someone immature, easily led. And a weak superego means no conscience.
That's the general idea. A weak ego struggles to cope with reality and delay gratification. An underdeveloped superego hasn't properly internalized society's rules and values. The theory also posits other links, like maybe some offenders have an unconscious desire for punishment due to unresolved guilt, or maybe crime is a way to express frustration or achieve a sense of power denied elsewhere.
Are specific mental or behavioral disorders highlighted here?
Yes, conditions like conduct disorder, CD, are often discussed. CD involves that persistent pattern of really serious antisocial behavior, bullying, fighting, cruelty, destruction, lying, theft. It's seen as potentially stemming from these early developmental issues.
And oppositional defiant disorder, ODD, is related.
Right. ODD is often seen as a milder precursor, involving defiance, hostility, and argumentativeness towards authority figures. While not everyone with ODD or CD becomes a serious adult offender, they represent significant risk factors and often involve difficulties with impulse control, empathy, and rule following, which are central concerns in psychodynamic perspectives on crime.
What about links to more severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder?
The link between major mental illness and crime is really complex and often overstated in popular perception. The vast majority of people with mental illness are not violent and are more likely to be victims than perpetrators. However, some studies do suggest an increased risk for violence in certain specific circumstances. particularly when serious mental illness co-occurs with substance abuse. But it's crucial not to generalize. Mental illness is not a primary driver of most crime.
Okay, that's important context. Let's move on to behavioral theory. This shifts the focus to learning, right?
Exactly. Behavioral theory, drawing from people like Tarde, but especially later figures like Albert Bandura, fundamentally argues that human actions, including criminal ones, are learned responses. Behavior is shaped by its consequences. Reinforcement rewards makes a behavior more likely. Punishment makes it less likely.
So crime isn't necessarily seen as stemming from deep psychological problems.
Not necessarily. In this view, crime can be a perfectly rational, learned response to particular life situations or environmental cues if it leads to desired outcomes or avoids punishment effectively.
And Bandura's social learning theory is key here.
Absolutely central. Bandura argued that we don't just learn from our own direct experiences of reward and punishment, we also learn vicariously by observing others.
Observing family, friends, the media.
All of the above. We learn by watching what others do and what happens to them as a result. If we see others being rewarded for aggression, or if we see violence portrayed as effective or acceptable, particularly in the media, we might learn those aggression scripts ourselves.
So the whole debate about media violence fits right in here.
Perfectly. Social learning theory provides a direct mechanism for how exposure to violence could potentially translate into learned aggressive behavior. It suggests that media portrayals can provide models for imitation, normalize violence, increase arousal, shape attitudes toward aggression, and potentially lower inhibitions against it if violence is shown without negative consequences.
Didn't David Phillips do a study on homicides after boxing matches?
Yes, that's an example sometimes cited, suggesting a potential short-term modeling effect.
But the link between media violence and real-world aggression is still heavily debated, isn't it?
Oh, very much so. It's one of the most researched and debated topics. Critics point out quite rightly that millions of people consume violent media and don't become violent criminals. Clearly, other factors are hugely important: individual predispositions, family environment, peer groups, social contexts.
So what's the general consensus, if there is one?
Well, meta-analyses, which combine results from many studies, tend to conclude that there is a statistically significant, though likely modest and complex, association between exposure to media violence and aggressive thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Experimental studies can show more immediate impacts, especially perhaps on individuals already predisposed to aggression. But translating that into real-world crime causation is where the debate really lies.
Okay, let's move to the third psychological perspective, cognitive theory. This focuses on how we think.
Exactly. Cognitive theory zooms in on our mental processes, how we perceive the world around us, how we store and retrieve information, how we reason and make decisions, how we solve problems, how we think shapes how we act.
Does this include things like our sense of right and wrong?
Yes. One important branch is moral development theory, most famously associated with Lawrence Kohlberg and his stages of moral reasoning.
What's the connection to crime there?
The theory suggests that people progress through different stages in how they think about moral dilemmas. Individuals who remain at lower stages, maybe only obeying rules to avoid punishment or purely out of self-interest, might be more prone to criminal behavior than those who reach higher stages, where they understand laws as based on social contracts or universal ethical principles. Offenders might simply have a different, less developed moral orientation.
And the information processing aspect.
This looks more at the mechanics of thinking, how we encode information coming in, search our memory for possible responses, evaluate those responses, decide on one, and then act. Differences in any stage of this process can lead to very different behavioral outcomes.
Like using learned scripts.
Precisely. Cognitive theorists talk about how we develop mental scripts based on past experiences. These are like default routines for interpreting situations and deciding how to react. If a child grows up exposed to violence or hostility, they might develop faulty, aggressive scripts.
So they might misread situations.
Exactly. They might become hypervigilant, quick to perceive threats or insults where none are intended, because their script tells them the world is hostile. They might react aggressively because that's the practiced response in their script, maybe even believing they're acting defensively while fundamentally misinterpreting the situation.
This sounds like it could explain both impulsive, reactive violence and maybe more calculated crime, too.
It could, yes. A faulty script might lead to an immediate aggressive reaction. Or faulty information processing could lead someone to conclude, incorrectly, that crime is the best or only way to solve a problem or meet a need. Cognitive deficits can also impair judgment, perspective taking, and social problem-solving skills.
The date rape example is sometimes mentioned here.
Yes, as a potential example of misinterpreting signals like interpreting no differently due to a distorted cognitive script about relationships or consent.
Can these cognitive issues be addressed through therapy?
Yes, that's the focus of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT approaches. They aim to help individuals identify their faulty or distorted thinking patterns and aggressive scripts. Then, they teach new ways of thinking, reframing situations, considering alternative responses, improving problem-solving skills, managing anger and impulses. Learning new social skills and practicing non-aggressive scripts shows real promise in rehabilitation.
Okay, finally, under psychological traits, Siegel discusses personality and intelligence. Let's start with personality.
Right. Personality refers to those relatively stable patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that make us individuals. Psychologists have long debated whether certain personality traits are linked to criminality. Early researchers like the Glucks identified traits they saw as common in antisocial youth. Hans Eysenck proposed dimensions like extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism.
What traits seem most consistently linked in more recent research?
Research, like that by Miller and Lynham, often points to low levels of two key personality dimensions. Agreeableness, which relates to things like empathy, cooperation, and how you handle interpersonal relationships, and conscientiousness, which involves impulse control, planning, organization, responsibility, and having an internalized moral code.
So people low on those dimensions might be more hostile, self-centered, impulsive, irresponsible.
Those are the kinds of traits often associated, yeah. Hostile, spiteful, jealous, indifferent to others, lacking ambition or perseverance, difficulty controlling impulses, holding unconventional values.
Is it seen as a direct cause or, again, an interaction?
Generally viewed as an interaction. These traits might create a predisposition, but they also influence the situations people get into and how they react. Low conscientiousness might lead to school failure or job instability, which then increases crime risk. Personality tests like the MMPI or CPI has scales that studies show can distinguish between offending and non-offending groups, suggesting some underlying differences potentially rooted in development.
And then there's intelligence. This has a long and pretty controversial history in criminology.
Extremely controversial.
Well,
Early on, there was a strong belief, pushed by figures like Goddard, that low intelligence, low IQ was a major, even primary cause of crime. They studied inmates, found low average IQs, and concluded feeble-mindedness led to crime.
that was the nature argument. Low IQ is genetic and causes crime.
Exactly. But then the nurture argument pushed back hard. Critics argued that IQ tests themselves were culturally biased, that low scores reflected poor environments, lack of education, or test bias, not inherent low intelligence causing crime. Slauson's work highlighted this cultural bias aspect.
So where does the research stand today? Is there a link between IQ and crime?
It's still debated, believe it or not. Some major reviews, like one by Hershey and Hendelang back in the 70s, concluded there was a moderate indirect link. Low IQ led to poor school performance, which then led to delinquency. But they argued there was still a direct link too, independent of school performance. Moffitt's research also supported the pathway through school failure.
What about more recent arguments?
The debate reignited fiercely with the publication of The Bell Curve by Herrnstein and Murray in the 90s. They argued forcefully for a significant direct link, presenting data showing lower average IQs around 92 versus a norm of 100 in offender populations, even chronic offenders having lower scores.
And they argued it wasn't just that less intelligent criminals were the ones getting caught.
Right. They used self-report data as well, arguing the IQ gap persisted even for crimes that didn't result in arrest, countering the capture bias argument. But critics still raised significant concerns. Methodological problems, persistent issues of racial and class bias in IQ testing, and the fact that IQ, which is relatively stable over life, doesn't easily explain things like the sharp drop in crime after adolescence to the age crime curve.
This isn't just an academic debate, though, is it?
Yeah.
It has real-world consequences.
Absolutely. A huge one is in the justice system regarding capital punishment. The Supreme Court ruling in Atkins v. Virginia declared executing offenders with significantly low IQs unconstitutional.
Why was that?
The reasoning was that significant intellectual disability impairs reasoning, judgment, and impulse control to a degree that reduces moral culpability and responsibility. It directly connects the cognitive trait to legal accountability.
So wrapping this all together, whether we're looking at the biological side or the psychological side, these trait theories clearly have implications for how we think about crime control and prevention.
Oh, definitely. If individual traits, interacting with environment, play a significant role, then interventions can potentially target those traits or buffer against negative environmental influences. It points towards primary prevention trying to intervene early.
What might those interventions look like?
Well, on the biosocial side, you might see recommendations for things like improving nutrition, reducing exposure to environmental toxins like lead, treating allergies, addressing learning disabilities. More controversially, sometimes mood-altering medications are used for specific issues, though things like psychosurgery are extremely rare, experimental, and ethically charged. And on the psychological side, this is where a lot of standard rehabilitation efforts come in. Individual counseling, group therapy, behavior modification programs, and especially as we discussed, cognitive therapies focused on changing thinking patterns, teaching impulse control, improving problem solving and social skills.
So the overall aim is to bolster internal controls or help individuals navigate their environment more pro-socially.
Exactly. Enhance self-control, build better social and problem-solving skills, reduce aggression and impulsivity, target those traits and skills linked to antisocial behavior.
This has certainly been a deep dive into a really complex and sometimes, yeah, controversial area of criminology. We've traced the history from early biological ideas through the development of modern biosocial theories, looking at everything from body chemistry and brain function to genetics and evolution, all interacting with the environment.
And then we explored the psychological theories, psychodynamic views on early development, behavioral ideas about learning, cognitive approaches to thinking and processing, and the role of personality and intelligence.
I think the crucial takeaway from modern trait theory is really moving beyond that simplistic born or made question. Instead, it frames crime as this incredibly complex outcome. It results from a dynamic interplay between an individual's unique characteristics and the specific environmental context they live in.
And that's the core message, yes. It's not nature versus nurture, but nature and nurture, constantly interacting in complex ways.
Which leaves us with a pretty challenging thought to mull over as we finish. If scientific research continues to identify specific biological or psychological traits that genuinely do increase an individual's statistical risk of engaging in criminal behavior, what are the ethical implications for us as a society? How do we decide if, when, or even how to identify and potentially intervene with individuals who possess these traits, perhaps long before any actual crime has even been committed?